In the current era of globalization, people have become connected on unprecedented levels, creating new opportunities for some and daunting threats for others. Some may argue that the gap between the high-income and low-income world is constantly increasing, as the developed nations are innovating exponentially, and developing nations are struggling to open their markets to globalization. Although much of globalization is about breaking down boundaries, it has also become an intense power struggle where human rights and labor issues are at stake. These issues are clear when examining agriculture and the fate of farmers. In the ideal world, trade liberalization and globalization of agriculture would increase the production of food and improve the economic situation of farmers. Instead, this process has led to a decline in food production and productivity, a decline in conditions for farmers, and a decline in food security for consumers. Small farmers around the world are being pushed aside as food corporations controlling U.S. agriculture are now attempting to control world agriculture. Domestic policies that support international deals fuel the interest of corporate agribusiness. As a result, the policies created by companies are motivated by profit and not the economic health of the farmer, the health of the consumer, or the vitality of the rural community. Policies in the U.S. force prices as low as possible by removing effective commodity loan rates or reserve. These policies force world prices to levels unsustainable for farmers around the world. This is leading to a new poverty for small farmers as unequal and unfair contracts lock them into a new form of bondage.
In most of the least developed countries, or LDCs, agriculture constitutes the backbone of the economy. It accounts for between 30 and 60% of the gross domestic product among LDCs and employs more people than any other sector, in some cases up to 70%. Agriculture supplies the bulk of basic food and provides subsistence and other sources of income to more than half of the LDC's population. Despite the importance of agriculture to the LDC's economy, however, it has remained largely undeveloped, and they are increasingly dependent on food imports. The domestic consumption of food products is large in the face of a growing proportion of output. For many commodities, production has not kept up with demand. Exports that have been traditional export commodities for LDCs have been performing badly. Tropical beverages that are exported, such as coffee, tea, cocoa, all experienced negative growth from the 1970s to 2003. With these current situations, it is important to assess the level of food adequacy, which is the interaction between food supply and demand factors in LDCs. The most efficient way of measuring food adequacy is through dietary energy supply, or DES, which measures the food available to each person on average in a country. Between 2001 and 2003, for 17 out of 45 LDCs for which data is available, the dietary energy supply was below 2,100 calories a day. With the onset of globalization and the liberalization of agriculture, a giant food production, manufacturing, and delivery system known as agribusiness has taken over, in which the small farmer is just one factor. Control of global agriculture is being put into the hands of a few major corporations, such as ConAgra, Cargill, ADM, and Monsanto, who seek to reduce the number of farmers and expand the size of farms and the scope of agricultural markets. In the book, Globalizing India, Jackie Asyag writes,
"The leading 10 seed-producing companies represent one-third of the $23 billion in this trade and control nearly 100% of the market in transgenic seeds. The same companies account for more than 20% of the $30 billion of trades in pesticides, which is equivalent to 44% of total sales. Finally, these 10 leading companies retain 61% of the veterinary market, which according to figures in the year 2000 amounts to $16 billion.
These corporations are replacing farmers with machines and mixed crops with monocrops, further depleting the economies of LDCs. Through technological developments, agricultural corporations have created chemical fertilizers and pesticides, hybrid seeds, and genetically modified plants. Agriculture business, or agribusiness, is taking over and manipulating the agricultural system to create a monopoly. This is exemplified in the Indian case study conducted by Jackie S. Yag.
The objective is to introduce this technology to all seeds produced in Indian laboratories, so that farmers will not be able to utilize seeds from the previous harvest and will be totally dependent on seed companies that will then harvest a monopoly.
Farmers have to pay more for the production inputs they need, such as energy and fertilizer, in return for diminishing prices for their products, forcing them into debt or off their land. This process has created major problems for LDCs in their efforts to develop agriculture and achieve poverty reduction through improving food security and increasing export earnings. With the growing integration of markets due to globalization and liberalization, economies are facing a more fiercely competitive trading environment. LDC's exports have become limited to a range of commodities that are highly vulnerable to instability in supply, demand, and a decline in terms of trade. Their agriculture is susceptible to weather conditions, leaving them subject to rapid changes in surplus and deficit situations. Factory farms are now being exported to the developing world. U.S. agricultural policy has promoted a get big or get out policy that has encouraged overproduction. Agriculture commodities such as corn, wheat, and soybeans have flooded the market and prices have plunged. Agricultural subsidies further increase profits for agribusiness, encouraging them to expand and produce more. This, however, affects global prices, and farmers in the developing world are hurt. In the book Making Globalization Work, author Joseph Stiglitz analyzes the effects of subsidies to poor African farmers. The aggregate agricultural subsidies of the United States, EU, and Japan, including hidden subsidies such as on water, if they do not actually exceed the total income of sub-Saharan Africa, amount to at least 75% of that region's income, making it almost impossible for African farmers to compete in world markets. The average European cow gets a subsidy of $2 a day. More than half of the people in the developing world live on less than that. It appears it is better to be a cow in Europe than to be a poor person in a developing country. Small farmers are suddenly unable to break even and are forced to sell their land to industrial farm corporations. During an interview with Professor Stephen Lee, a philosophy professor at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, we asked him about the impact of transnational corporations taking over small farms. His response was this.
I think it's usually a bad effect. I think the effect can vary, but I think it probably tends to be a negative effect because you get a situation where you have individuals who had owned land and then the land is bought and they become employees of the corporation and so forth, and they're much more subject to the vicissitudes of economic ups and downs and so forth than they would if they grew food, so they would always have food to eat if they had their own flock. But now a transnational corporation comes in, they decide to grow food for export, and they don't have as much to eat. Times get rough in terms of food supply.
In the developing world, small-scale farmers are unable to compete with the cheap food products exported by corporate agribusiness. When farming becomes more lucrative because of the subsidies, the demand for land is increased, driving up the price. With the price of land so high, farming has to become capital intensive. It has to make heavy use of fertilizers and herbicides, which are as bad for the environment as the increased output is for farmers in the developing world. As a result, small farmers who don't have the resources for this kind of capital-intensive farming find it attractive to sell out to large farmers and cash in the capital gain, says Stiglitz. As developed nations try to become more fuel efficient and less reliant on oil in the Middle East, they've turned to agricultural means such as corn to produce ethanol. Corn has become a major cash crop to produce fuel rather than food, leading to a shortage in food supply. Again, Professor Stephen Lee commented on this.